Hello, and welcome back to the Security Spotlight podcast. My name is Max Robodeau from the portfolio marketing team here at Dell Technologies, and we're going to be continuing our conversation from last week about GenAI and security. So last week, we really looked at the risks and the vulnerabilities, security risk and vulnerabilities about GenAI. And this week, we're going to be touching on the other side of the coin. How can GenAI help improve your security posture? So with me again, like we had last episode, are Steve and Nick. Last week, Nick left off the episode talking about James Earl Jones and lending his voice to potential future properties in the Star Wars universe, and also talked about Jet Li and how he was a little bit more concerned about using his name, image, and likeness and kind of lending himself to some GenAI properties. So let's start at a really high level, talk about with GenAI, what are some of the potential benefits that we can see, not necessarily having to touch on security?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off for why I'm excited. First off, as a marketer, there's no shortage of conversations to have. There's no shortage of audiences that we can reach. It's just a matter of time, And so, what's really exciting for me about generative AI is the ability to extend all of the narratives I have to different audiences, to different assets, different documents that people can leverage. Now, when you put this in context of everyone's roles, pretty much everyone across the board is going to see the ability to be more productive, I think. The other thing is there's a lot of benefits to it, such as being able to get more work done quickly, so you maybe don't have to work as many hours, right? I know, especially in IT and security, that's a massive challenge. The other thing is the skills gap, right? Believe it or not, once upon a time, someone was crazy enough to ask me to do a hands-on lab where I was going to stand up a VxRel with Windows Server and Hyper-V. And I was supposed to, at the time I was a consultant, so I was supposed to get a technical SME, and they didn't provide it. So what I ended up having to do is I ended up having to go and watch a bunch of videos, look at code snippets, and kind of stitch it together and just roll the dice and see if I got it right. Now, that took me about 3-4 weeks to get all that done. I've played around with it, done the same thing. I go and ask, generative AI, say, write me a script to deploy Windows Server onto a PowerEdge server using iDRAC. That's all I had to say, right? Like, that is insane. And then it spit out the documentation about how to do that, right?
Like 10 seconds, right?
Yeah, in like 10 seconds, right? So, like, imagine somebody like me is now able to interact with a technology, with a domain that I never could have hoped to have this level of competency in. So that's pretty powerful, right? And I think then when we look at security specifically, like, man, that's going to really help out with a lot of this. There's also, I forgot to mention the needle in the haystack problem that comes up with security a lot. But like, imagine this, like, there's things that you would never see in a million years. You don't have the ability to consume that much data, that much information. Like, you can't just go and read every single book that's in the Library of Congress, right? It's just, that's a lot of information. But these machines can't. And then you can ask them a question on it and it can spit out the answer. So that is really powerful, to be able to have that kind of knowledge in your back pocket. And especially when you apply your own data from a business perspective, it's even more valuable.
So Nick, I want to ask you a question, because this has been plaguing my mind. I do want to come back to, because I think you hit a very, very important point on the skills gap and the knowledge about security. But before we go there and we talk about that for a second, every single time you use like a chat GPT, and I'm a big fan, right? Like I'm in the same boat as you as a marketer. I think I have specific skills about taking words and knowledge and translating tech speak into business speak. And this kind of helps me get going, because I'm not always good at getting going, but it helps me get going. But every time I put something in, it says, as of my last, ingest of information in 2020 or whatever it was. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a gap. And I bring this up because a lot of times when I talk to customers, especially about security, I say, it's important to educate your employees. And of course, they all think, make sure they don't, give them that training, don't pick on a phishing email, which everybody knows, right? But I tell them it's also important to educate your IT employees on kind of the latest and greatest solutions that are out there so that they're getting the latest and greatest solutions to go attack some of these problems, right? So how do you justify that 2-year gap in what could potentially be that new latest and greatest thing to kind of advance those skills that they might not have today with the gap that's in the generative AI solutions? Do we see that closing anytime soon, or?
I mean, well, I'll say first off, I think that's more a Chat GPT thing. First off, I think that if I recall correctly, I think Bing and what is it, Bard from Google, I think they don't have that same gap, if I recall correctly. Now, the other thing you can do, and this comes back to, one, it's going to depend. But let's say you read an article about a specific type of technology, or you get maybe you're going to go and you're going to find documentation on a specific type of technology that wasn't out 2-3 years ago. You can actually manually feed that into certain LLMs. And especially if you're doing it on-prem, that's one of the things I always hammer about is the document retrieval, the retrieval augmented generation. That's where you can just point it at a certain domain, and you just need a developer to write it in there and say, I want you to look at all of this, reference only this material. And the thing is, the model has picked up the knowledge about how to comprehend and understand things from the original training, right? And so what you can then do is with this, by pointing it to the data, it will interpret that given its prior knowledge. Now, it's not perfect, right? Because here's the thing is, I always, the easy button that I try to explain is like, let's say that you have a bunch of pictures of cats and dogs and pets, right? And let's say the model is trained to tell you if it's a cat or not. So it'll say cat, no cat, right? You're going to have to retrain that model if you want it to say it's a dog, right? So the retrieval augmented generation is kind of a half step above simple inferencing. And then, where things get really interesting is when you start to do the tuning and retraining, right? And that's where you could maybe learn more out of it. But to answer your question, there are some ways around that 2-year gap. But yeah, it is a concern.
But I do think you hit the nail on the head with talking about the skills gap. We've in security been talking about this for a couple of years now, right? And just the mere fact, like you said, as a technical person, but maybe not super technical on a particular thing, you can say, hey, I need to know, I need to know something about what's a better, faster, smarter way to detect security breaches, right? And it can throw out a list for you, and then from there, and at least in my limited experience, right, you can say, oh, this part sounds interesting. Let's take some of that and let's learn a little bit more about it. And within moments, like I've now gone down this path about XDR, which I never would have known a little while ago, but I'm pretty confident that that's a decent way to get to where I want to go. It might not be the final answer, but it's a good way.
It is so funny that you mentioned XDR, because the company I worked at before, Dell, was an XDR company with wire data. And what the interesting thing is, sometimes we would get on these calls with customers that didn't buy our products. We just wanted to understand, what was your experience like, and what did you find out, and why didn't you buy? And it was the craziest experience I've ever had, because they always came back to one thing as why they didn't buy, and it was imposter syndrome. They said, as long as your engineers are here, I am confident that this thing can work. And I used to joke and call it the Eye of Sauron, because it saw everything, right? Everything that was happening on the network. But the problem is if you see everything and you don't understand what you're looking at, people would rather go back to old packet capture that they understand with Wireshark, right? So it was really a fascinating dilemma. But guess what solves that dilemma now? Generative AI. Because now you pair that up with that product and you're in business. Because if I don't understand what I'm seeing, I go and ask the generative AI, what am I seeing? And it goes, this is what I think you're seeing. And it provides the answer. So now you're no longer that imposter syndrome person. You're no longer afraid or unaware and have that skills gap. Now, all of a sudden, you're augmented, right? You're able to do this work. And that's what we see this as. It's a human-machine partnership. It's an augmentation. It's not replacing people.
Yeah, Nick, so let's dive a little bit deeper into kind of that partnership and what specifically we can look at in terms of benefits from the security front. So What can we see in terms of like a proactive cyber defense with Gen AI? Is there any kind of examples you can share about how specifically it can help with the security posture?
I think the first thing is, a lot of times it's just good hygiene within your organization, right? So one of the good things that you can do with this is you can do things like documentation. You can set that documentation. Now, it's important to note that like generative AI isn't the same as AI, right? So it's not going to do things like AI ops for you, but it can work alongside AI ops, right? You can automate, and you can use some of this to help with the automation, but you're still going to have those automation tool sets, right? So it's not like generative AI does everything, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions right now is we have people come in and they ask all sorts of questions to us, and they're talking about different types of technologies, and they're not actually generative AI, they're AI. But the documentation thing is one good one. Being able to analyze and interpret massive amounts of data, being able to provide information to different classes or different groups of people who maybe before they weren't able to understand and comprehend some of that security information. Now you might be able to write best practices and shoot them out by email to show, to let people know like what is transpiring, like the latest and greatest vulnerabilities or threats, so they don't trip over them. Synthetic data, I almost forgot about that one, but like in this space, synthetic data is really important because how do you stop something you've never seen, right? So, I mean, do you want to wait till somebody else figures this out and they've attacked you, or do you want to, maybe use some synthetic data to help figure out like what's going on inside your environment, right? All those things, again, back to the needle in the haystack I've talked about before too, just analyzing and absorbing tons of data. How many of these threats are just things we never see because we just don't have time? I think that those are all things you can be proactive. And then, obviously things like patching and stuff like that, you can also be proactive using this to kind of track and update and make sure that everything's, maintained.
That's a good one, right? Just the back to the scale and the education piece, right? Just to be able to capture and see things that you didn't have the opportunity to see before. And I would agree with you. I don't know, and maybe Nick, maybe you have some insight, right? But I don't know of any company in security today, like I said, maybe you do, that has Gen AI solutions built into their solutions. I know some are coming from CrowdStrike and some of that, but do you know of any off the top of your head that have it built in today? Gen AI?
I'm curious about that because the company I did work at before did do a lot of analytics in AI. I don't know if it would cross over into generative AI. That's a good question. And I haven't been able to, it's funny. They called me this morning because I went to their website or something and they were like, are you a prospect? And I was like, no, I'm a former employee. But I haven't been there recently though. I would imagine they would have gone down this path. I'm sure Splunk has gone down this path or will, but again, it goes back to the data sources, right? So like, one of the things I was always kind of flagging and noting was that log data could be changed. So I was a big fan of the wire data because of the fact that if it occurred on the network, we see it, right? And that's really an interesting spot. So you raise a good question. I'm sure it'll be coming. Pretty much every single SaaS provider on the planet should be developing their own generative AI. And then the interesting thing here is you wonder is for those companies, is it better to build your own in-house or is it better to use one of these models? And I think since the data is the differentiator, it really makes a lot of sense to build your own. And then the question is how do I get my customers to agree to let me use their data to improve the product, right? So it's about anonymizing the data, doing it fleet wide and making sure that you're not exposing any risk to your customers.
It's interesting. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this only because it's funny when you think about security, and we're past the whole castle moat into the whole zero trust and protect everything these days, right? And you think about trying to wrap your arms around your infrastructure, whatever that means today, cloud, core, edge, right? It can mean anything. That's a variety of different solutions, right? And so back to what you were talking about before about training that model, right? That's an infinite number of Well, let's just think about it, right? If I'm a security tool, I'm looking at log files. I've got to look at log files from an infinite number
Yeah.
of solutions out there to be able to say, have I seen it? Have I not? Now, Dell has a lot of AI ML tools built into their solutions for, let's face it, a lot of anomaly detection, right? It doesn't look like it did before. That's kind of easy for the machine to learn by itself and then send up a warning, right? Maybe it's okay. Maybe there's just a change in the data habits of the people using the system. Now they're different. We're gonna tell you. But to get that Gen AI learning that everybody's become accustomed to using the tools, right? ChatGPT, Bard, whatever, right? That's a big data source, and that's why I was concerned. Like, like you said, I'm sure Cisco or someone is trying to figure some of that out. But okay, so that's the network. But there's a whole lot of other things in my environment that I got to be paying attention to.
Yeah, and you raised an interesting point because when I talked about last week about shadow AI and why it's more dangerous than shadow IT, I think one thing to really kind of point out on this is, when you're spinning something up on, AWS and you left an S3 bucket open, right? Somebody still had to find that S3 bucket. And then they had to know what in that S3 bucket was interesting. Now, of course, when we saw breaches, a lot of the times what you would see is that like there's structured data like social security numbers or credit card, that information, very easy to find that, right? But a lot of our data is unstructured. And so, a lot of these leaks, you wouldn't even hear about the challenges for intellectual property or other things. The scary thing now, and talking about zero trust with AI now, is imagine this. Not only does this tool set is able to interpret all your stuff, right? And you're saying, how do I interpret everything and how do I analyze everything? But think about it this way, the bad actors, now they have a tool that makes sense and synthesize all your stuff, right? So that's pretty concerning. Like you really need a zero trust kind of model because any access that is not what you're looking for is problematic. Even if you have backups, now it's like, well, yeah, the ransomware, yes, that's a problem and it's a big problem. But now I'm worried about like, what are people going to find in my data? And like, can they exploit that? And is it going to leave and go beyond the firewall? And that's typically when people find these things out. Like, a large retailer many years back, I read about what happened, and someone had gained access to their systems, and they knew that the point of sales terminals were all being updated by one system. So they sent a payload out to every single point of sale terminal. Then they stood up their own SQL server in the environment. No one noticed that we just had an extra SQL server. And they started collecting all of that data during the Christmas shopping season. And it only got noticed when, oops, there's like at the firewall, there's a huge amount of data that's leaving. And they're like, what is that? And it was like, that was us just getting one of the biggest breaches of all time of personal identifiable information. So it's going to be so important. Like it's never been more important with security.
Yeah.
Yeah, couldn't agree more there, Nick. So before we wrap this up, is there one piece of information or is there something you'd like to leave the audience with one piece of advice to help ensure responsible and also secure implementation of Gen AI?
Yeah, I think definitely policies, starting off and having a policy, even if your policy is do not use generative AI yet until we get it figured out. It's important to communicate what your expectations are to your employees, right? Here at Dell, we've been very clear about what they are. And so we have some ability to use it for certain use cases. There's certain things we shouldn't be using it for, et cetera. I would say it's important for, IT and for security to get on top of this. And you don't sit this one out. Like we sat it out originally with cloud, right? IT was like, I don't want to lose control. And all it takes is a credit card to swipe and go. Scary thing about generative AI, it doesn't even take a credit card, right? Like there's all these free options out there that people might just inject their data into and not realize it's learning from them. So secure access to a generative AI tool that spans your entire organization is an imperative. You cannot sit this one out.
Awesome. Great. Well, Nick, thank you so much for hopping on. I think this is a good place to end the episode. And to our listeners, as always, please subscribe to the Security Spotlight podcast, wherever you get your podcast. If you want to learn more about our security solutions, please visit us at dell.com/security solutions. And for more on GenAI, visit us at dell.com/GenAI. And to listen to the first part of this conversation where we talked about, the risks associated with GenAI, please go back either to the Security Spotlight podcast or find us on YouTube. So Nick, Steve, thank you both so much for hopping on this episode and the last one.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Nick.